Hey everybody, here with part 2 of our Thinking Through FRQs series for week 1. Here we're looking at a different type of density, agricultural density. Right, so we've looked at population density in general, right, this strict people per land area. And so what we have to think about is that there are 3 types of population densities. Right, there's what we call arithmetic density, there is physiological density, and there is what we call agricultural density. Now, for each of these densities, there's a different ratio of objects to space. So for arithmetic density, it's just the number of objects per land area. And that's it. And usually we're thinking about people, right, as the objects that we're measuring. Physiological density, we're looking at the number of people per unit of arable land, right? That's the land that's good or useful for farming and agriculture. Agricultural density, we're looking at the number of farmers per unit of arable land, hence agricultural density, right? So we're looking at these different factors, and here we're looking at agricultural density in specific. So what we have to think about here is what the densities are, right? That's no different from the first stimulus we looked at. We're looking at the map, we're looking at the stimulus, analyze it first. I'm talking about agricultural density. These are farmers per square kilometer of arable land, usual choropleth type map, right? The lighter shades are fewer farmers per square kilometer. The darker shade here is more farmers per square kilometer. So I'm going to think through the same sorts of answers, right? The same sorts of ideas, right? And I'm really only concerned with the agricultural density in this case, right? So what I have to think about is agriculture, right? How does it relate to density, right? Is too many farmers a bad thing? Right, these are kind of the questions that are popping up in my head when I'm thinking about looking at FRQ. If this is the stimulus that they provide to me, these are the questions I want to ask. Because usually I'm going to be thinking of some kind of effect, right? What does this density mean for the environment? What does it mean for the people who live in these spaces? Now, I'm going to identify some of these high density areas, right? And you can do this along with me. I'm sure you've already looked at some of the high density spaces, right? I look at the map, I want to think, all right, darker shade, darker shade, darker shade. These are my high densities. And I see a lot of these in China, India, and most of Asia to begin with, right? I see this a lot in Central Africa, in Egypt, right? Parts of the Middle East, what I would call, and I can separate this out, right, as a different region, parts of the Middle East, and specifically Yemen and Oman, right? These are these 2 countries that are here. I want to include here Southeast Asia as well, right, with my Indonesia space that's here. And those are going to be the highest density spaces that I really have, right? Iceland I have way up here, but it's kind of an outlier. I can put it down, but I'm thinking that I'm not going to be thinking too much about Iceland in this case. All right, now out of this, again, I want to think about my levels of development. So most of Asia here is going to be NIC, Southeast Asia, NIC, Central Africa and Egypt, LDC, some NIC, and parts of the Middle East. These 2 in particular will be LDCs, and Iceland is my MDC. All right, so I have all these different factors and facets. Right, now in thinking through these agricultural densities and thinking about the farmers I have per land, one thing that's always going to come up when we think about population density, when we think about whether it's physiological, agricultural, or arithmetic, is this always has to come back to carrying capacity. Right, this is the ability of that environment to support a human population or any population that lives within that space. So what we have to do here is have that in mind, because if we don't, we're missing a big point, right? We're missing a big portion of this question and what it might ask us. Now, aside from these densities, I'm looking at NIC, LDC, NIC. And so I want to think about the types of farming, types of agriculture that may happen in these spaces. And I know that in large swaths of Asia, South Asia and Southeast Asia, I have a lot of wet rice farming, right? I know in Indonesia, right, in this tropical region, right here in Central Africa through Indonesia, the Southeast Asian portion, I have a lot of slash and burn agriculture, All right, and these are just things from the agriculture unit, things that I want to have in mind as I'm thinking through these. Right, feel free, go back, look at those review videos for agriculture to see the different types of ag that we have in the world, so you have these ideas of where agriculture is located. And outside of that, I want to start thinking here what kind of impacts these could have. Right, I have a lot of farmers in these areas. I know the majority of these farmers may be engaged in these two particular practices, right, wet rice farming and slash and burn. And so from then on, just like when I thought about overpopulation, I want to think about the effects that these types of farming may have on the environment and on people. So my wet rice farming, if you don't remember, involves a number of steps. Right, you have to flood the fields, you have to till the fields. So we have what we call terracing in some of these areas, right, where they carve into the hills to create these steps, so that you have a flat space for farming. Right, there's a flooding of the fields, and we looked at a number of articles throughout this year. One in particular that talked about wet rice farming and how they use salt water to flood the fields. And then we look at the water itself, right, from that flooding. Now, out of this flooding, and I'm going to shift this a little bit, right, so I have a little more space to write. So I'm going to take this wet rice farming, and I'm going to move it down, right, a little more, because I want to have some more space here. And what I'm going to end up seeing is that with this red rice farming, with this terracing, flooding fields in particular, there are a number of effects that happen because of that, right? And whenever it rains, what's the thing that we see the most, right? One, it gets humid, or it gets muggy. It's not the best to go outside. It's kind of difficult to get around because it's kind of all sweaty and sticky and gross. But the other thing that coincides with heavy rainfall are these big puddles, right? These large groups of water that are scattered all over the place. As it happens, these groups of water are hotbeds for insects, right? So insect populations, specifically mosquitoes, increase, right? Because they have all this new space to lay their eggs for their larvae to grow and develop into these vectors for disease, right? These carriers of disease. Aside from this, using the salt water to flood the fields, right? And we can say this is due to increased wetland area or still water. Aside from that, here, I'm going to get rid of our stuff up here. We also look at the flooding of the fields with salt water itself. Right, flooding using salt water contributes to salinization, right? An overabundance of salts in the soil, right, which is toxic to plants and to soil fertility. Right, it makes it sure that over time, it ensures that over time the soil fertility declines, and eventually we're not able to use that land anymore because it's not arable after the salinization process has occurred. So you have these different effects, right? And if we have a bunch of farmers doing this, that means that these environmental effects are either one, more likely to happen, or two, they're happening more often because we have all these farmers in these single spaces. Right, and this all goes back to that carrying capacity. Right, carrying capacity, yes, is about right how to provide, right, how many resources are provided, but it's also about the ability of the land to provide resources, the land or the space to provide resources, and that includes land arability. Right, if we decrease the arability of the land, its fertility to produce crops or be good for grazing or what have you, then we lose out on future crop yield. And that affects the carrying capacity because then we decrease that carrying capacity over time. Now, if I'm thinking of my slash and burn, right, if I think about the process of slashing and burning, the biggest impact, of course, is deforestation. Right, we have a lot of farmers who are maybe performing this type of agriculture throughout these regions. And what that means for us is that we have increased levels of deforestation because farmers are slashing down these forest areas to make room for the farmland. After that, we have the burning process, right? Or the burning of remaining vegetation, right? And they use while they use the ash and remains for soil or as soil nutrients, right? the final part of this process, right, before they move on to other plots of land, involves, right, using a plot of land until the soil is no longer fertile. Right, they use that piece of land as much as they can without letting it rest until that fertility declines completely. And then the process repeats itself. Right, so we have all these different reasons for why this carrying capacity might be affected. But walking through this, I'm thinking about just what happens in these places. Right, I framed it with thinking about farmers because that's what this map is telling me about. The farmers per square kilometer of arable land. So I need to be thinking about that relationship between the farmers and what they're doing, wet rice farming / and burn agriculture, and the arable land that's available, right? How these specific practices and how when we have in specific, right, lots or too many farmers engaging in these practices, what that might mean for the arability of the land in these specific regions in Central Africa and in East, South, and Southeast Asia. That's our agricultural density, how we might think through an FRQ on this topic. Again, the same basic foundation for thinking through these FRQs is the same. I'm looking at my stimulus and I'm trying to get as much information as I can out of it. And from then on, I'm just drawing my connections, right? If it's talking to me about farmers, I got to be thinking about farmers. I was talking about arable land and agricultural density and farmers on this arable land. I need to think about that interaction, right? How are these different spaces interacting with the people who live in those spaces? If we're just thinking about people themselves, population density, or if we're thinking about specific groups of people like farmers and their farming practices. Again, here's hoping that this proved useful to you. Feel free to go back and forth between this video and the previous one on our population density, which you can find on the other in the playlist for week 1. Again, hoping you're happy and healthy and safe. We'll see you next week.